She thought her little book of rules was the law. She sued me, but what she didn't know was that while she was busy writing fines, I was digging up the original covenants from 1985. In court, I presented one single document, and the judge had her case dismissed before her lawyer could even finish his opening statement. This is the story of how I took down the HOA and Brenda Jenkins in 6 minutes flat. My name is Ethan Miller, and for 3 years, I thought I lived the American dream in Willow Creek Estates. It's a place built on peace, quiet, and perfectly trimmed hedges. But that peace was an illusion, maintained only by the iron fist of one woman, Brenda Jenkins. Brenda, the president of our Homeowners Association, didn't just enforce the rules. She was the rules. She patrolled the streets in her immaculate white SUV, clipboard in hand, looking for the slightest deviation from her vision of suburban perfection. She wasn't just nosy. She was a dictator in a floral dress, and my seemingly innocent backyard project gave her the perfect opportunity to declare war. My violation? A custom-built, solar-powered woodshed I had constructed myself. It was nestled neatly behind my garage, perfectly functional, aesthetically pleasing, and painted a rich, forest green that blended seamlessly with the boundary trees. I admit I hadn't filed the mandatory Architectural Review Committee ARC request, but I assumed a simple woodshed, out of sight and painted a natural color, wouldn't warrant an inquisition. That assumption was my biggest mistake. The first sign of conflict wasn't a friendly knock. It was a crisp, official letter shoved under my door. It was titled First and Final Notice of Violation, and it read like a legal threat. It cited Section 4.3.b of the CC&Rs. All accessory structures, permanent or temporary, must receive prior written approval from the ARC regarding size, placement, and color palette. The letter, signed in a severe, looping script by Brenda Jenkins herself, demanded I apply for approval within 7 days or face a $250 per day fine, retroactive to the date of construction. I laughed it off at first. I quickly filled out the required forms, including blueprints and paint swatches, and mailed them with a slightly sarcastic cover letter, explaining the shed was merely 6 by 4 feet and essentially invisible from the street. I truly thought that would be the end of it. 2 days later, Brenda was standing on my lawn. She wasn't alone. She had brought Mr. Harrison from the board, a timid man who looked terrified to be there. Brenda's expression was tight, her eyes cold. "Mr. Miller," she announced, her voice pitched to carry, "your application has been rejected. The forest green you chose is considered too dominant for the Willow Creek aesthetic. Furthermore, the shed's roofline is 3 inches higher than the maximum permitted for an accessory structure of that footprint." I stared at her, genuinely speechless. It was an absurdity. The shade of green was exactly the color of the pine trees 20 feet away, and 3 inches was the difference between a functional roof and a non-functional one. I felt a slow, hot fury build inside me. "Brenda," I said, crossing my arms, "this is ridiculous. It's a woodshed. Are you seriously going to fine me over 3 inches of roofing felt and a slightly too dominant shade of green?" She didn't flinch. Her eyes narrowed. "Rules are rules. Mr. Miller, your lack of respect for the covenants is a clear sign of contempt for this community. The shed must be dismantled or modified immediately." I refused, of course. I told her flat out that her interpretation of the rules was malicious and that I would not spend hundreds of dollars to adjust a perfectly good structure based on her personal taste. That refusal, that moment of defiance, sealed my fate. The fines began compounding immediately. Within a week, the total was over $1,500. The weekly notices became more aggressive, threatening to place a lien on my property. I tried to contact the rest of the board, but Brenda had them terrified or completely on her side. I realized this wasn't about the shed. This was about Brenda asserting her absolute authority. She was making an example of me. Then, 2 months into the escalating war of envelopes and threats, a new, much heavier package arrived via certified mail. I signed for it, my hands shaking slightly. I tore open the thick envelope and pulled out the contents. It wasn't a fine. It wasn't another warning. It was a formal summons and complaint. Brenda Jenkins and the Willow Creek HOA were suing me. They were seeking not only the accumulated fines, which now topped 5 figures, but also legal fees, and were asking the court to compel me to dismantle the shed immediately, threatening eventual foreclosure. As I stared at the official county court stamp and the bolded case number, the gravity of the situation hit me. This was no longer a neighborly dispute. This was a legal war, and Brenda Jenkins had just fired the first, most terrifying shot. My stomach dropped. I knew then I had to fight back, not with anger, but with something she didn't possess, a hidden knowledge of the very rules she claimed to uphold. The summons and complaint felt like a punch to the gut. The official seal of the county court wasn't just ink on paper. It was a cold, hard escalation that threatened to dismantle my life. Brenda Jenkins wasn't playing petty games anymore. She was using the full, terrifying weight of the legal system to enforce her whim, and the demands were staggering. They were asking for over $20,000 in fines, legal costs, and, crucially, an injunction forcing me to immediately tear down the woodshed, with the implied threat that if I resisted, they would put a lien on my home. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was about financial ruin and control. The immediate stress was overwhelming. I couldn't sleep. Every passing car outside my window sounded like Brenda's white SUV, and every knock sent a jolt of panic through me. I was angry, yes, but mostly I was afraid that this petty despot would actually succeed in forcing me to pay thousands just because she didn't like the color green I chose. I spent the first week in a frantic search for a lawyer specializing in HOA disputes. The first one quoted me a $10,000 retainer, just to answer the initial complaint. The second one was even worse, warning me that HOA law was tricky and that fighting a well-funded association like Willow Creek could easily push the final bill past $50,000. Even if you win, Mr. Miller, one attorney said grimly, you'll have already lost. It was a cynical reality check. The cost of professional defense was a victory for Brenda, regardless of the outcome. I didn't have that kind of money to burn on a woodshed defense, and I certainly wasn't going to hand over my life savings to lawyers just to spite Brenda Jenkins. It was during a moment of sheer despair, sitting late one night at my kitchen table, the legal papers spread out like a morbid puzzle, that the true path forward crystallized. The lawyers had offered to fight the rules. I needed to fight the foundation of the rules. I decided, then and there, that I would represent myself. I would fight pro se. It was a crazy, high-stakes gamble, but it was the only way to level the playing field. My strategy would be simple. I would not argue whether my shed violated today's rules. I would argue whether today's rules themselves were legitimate, enforceable, or even properly updated. To do that, I needed to go back to the beginning, way back. My target was the original covenants, conditions, and restrictions CC&Rs that established the Willow Creek Estates HOA back in the mid-1980s. I realized that like any ancient document, the CC&Rs were bound to contain forgotten loopholes, lapse clauses, or outdated language that could be exploited. This initiated my deep dive into the historical records, my own personal, solitary legal research project. I started at the local library, poring over microfiche readers, searching through old county records, which quickly proved tedious and fruitless. The real gold was at the county recorder's office downtown. I spent days there, sitting at scratched wooden desks, sifting through thick, dusty ledgers. The air smelled of old paper and bureaucratic neglect. I requested copies of every recorded document related to Willow Creek Estate's formation, the original plat maps, the initial declarations, and the full text of the 1985 CC&Rs. The paper copy of the covenants alone was a brittle, stapled, 90-page behemoth, full of dense, archaic legal jargon and signatures from men long since retired or passed away. I felt like a detective searching for a hidden artifact. I highlighted every mention of the Architectural Review Committee ARC and every clause related to accessory structures. I started seeing patterns, rules about satellite dishes that were obsolete, specific limits on antenna height, and references to building materials that hadn't been in common use for decades. But the loophole I needed, the silver bullet, remained hidden. The tension was palpable. Every evening I returned home exhausted, with a small pile of highlighted failures. Brenda's lawsuit deadline was looming, and I was still swimming in historical paperwork. I was fighting alone, risking my home against a legal machine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the answer, the fatal flaw in Brenda's authority, was right there, buried deep within those brittle, fading pages, just waiting for me to find it. I just needed one more night, one more cup of coffee, and one more close read of a section Brenda Jenkins had clearly forgotten existed. The pursuit of the original covenants became an obsession. My home office was no longer a place of rest, but a cramped, brightly lit bunker filled with stacks of photocopies, highlighted pages, and the pervasive, dry smell of decades-old paper. I was drowning in legal jargon, servitudes, easements, appurtenances. Every night, I would meticulously cross-reference the current HOA rulebook, Brenda Jenkins' Bible, with a brittle 1985 declaration. The current rules were neat, concise, and restrictive. The originals were sprawling, contradictory, and clearly drafted by someone who never imagined the internet. The pressure was mounting. The court date was less than 3 weeks away, and my legal defense consisted of a few library books and a rapidly dwindling supply of hope. I had found plenty of trivial inconsistencies, like a rule about where to hitch your horse, a relic of the community's initial, aspirational branding, but nothing that could tear down Brenda's case. I was looking for a grenade, and all I had found were confetti cannons. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. My days were spent at my regular job, and my nights were a solitary fight against the history of suburban zoning. I felt the weight of Brenda's smug certainty pressing down on me. She was confident because she knew the average homeowner would never delve this deep. They would pay the fine or dismantle the shed. I, however, had committed to being the exception. I focused my attention on the sections related to the Architectural Review Committee ARC, the very body that had rejected my forest green woodshed. Brenda cited their continuous authority, but the original documents were ambiguous. Hidden deep within Section 9, a dense portion detailing the term limits for various governance aspects, I found a paragraph titled Dissolution and Continuation of Covenants. It was written in microscopic print and seemed largely boilerplate, dealing with what would happen if the HOA formally disbanded. But tucked inside subsection 9.4, there it was, a single, fatal sentence I must have read a dozen times without truly seeing it, notwithstanding any other provision herein. The specific architectural control provisions contained in Article 4, including the establishment of the Architectural Review Committee, shall automatically terminate 20 years following the date of this declaration, unless re-ratified by a minimum of 75% of all parcel owners prior to said termination date. My heart stopped. I felt a rush of adrenaline so strong I nearly knocked my chair over. The original declaration was signed and recorded in October 1985. 20 years from that date was October 2005. If that clause was still valid, the entire basis for Brenda's fines, the ARC's authority to dictate the color of my shed, the height of its roof line, the very enforcement mechanism she was using to sue me, had legally expired almost 20 years ago. I frantically cross-referenced the county records. Had the community re-ratified the ARC's power in 2005? There was no record of a formal 75% majority vote being filed with the county recorder's office. No record of a notarized, binding amendment extending the term. Brenda and her predecessors had simply kept enforcing the rule, assuming its validity, or, perhaps, hoping no one would ever notice the obscure sunset clause buried in the covenant's fine print. They had been operating under expired authority for 2 decades. The realization hit me like a thunderclap. This was bigger than my woodshed. This wasn't just a loophole. It was a fundamental flaw in the legal structure of the HOA's most intrusive power. Brenda Jenkins wasn't just abusing the rules. She was enforcing rules that, in the eyes of the law, no longer existed. The sheer magnitude of the discovery was dizzying. All the hours, the stress, the fear of financial ruin, it all vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. My initial plan was to simply defeat her case. My new plan was to demolish the very foundation of her tyrannical reign. I looked at the fragile, yellowing page, then at the clock. 3:15 a.m. A silent, powerful grin spread across my face. Brenda Jenkins had brought a knife to a gunfight. I carefully highlighted the critical clause, placed the document in a pristine plastic sleeve, and began preparing my court exhibit. The tension was gone, replaced by the quiet, absolute confidence of a man holding the winning hand. The fight wasn't over, but the victory was now inevitable. The courtroom air was stale and heavy, thick with the silence of official procedure. This wasn't the dramatic theater of TV legal dramas. It was a small claims courtroom, but for me, Ethan Miller, the stakes felt like the entire world. I sat alone at the defense table. My stomach knotted with a mixture of fear and the icy calm of certainty. Facing me was Brenda Jenkins, seated next to her counsel, a sleek, expensive-looking attorney named Mr. Harrison, not the timid board member, but a professional shark clearly billing the HOA by the hour. Brenda's face was a mask of smug satisfaction. She didn't even look at me, confident in the crushing weight of her accumulated fines and her lawyer's expensive suit. Her belief in her own righteousness was absolute. When the judge, a weary but stern woman named Judge Thompson, called my case, Mr. Harrison launched into his argument with practiced aggression. He rattled off the list of violations: the unauthorized color, the 3-inch roofline deviation, the subsequent failure to comply, and the accrued 5-figure fines. He painted me as a defiant, irresponsible scofflaw who showed contempt for the community's standards and financial solvency. His argument was polished, focusing entirely on the undisputed facts of the shed and the current rules. Then, it was my turn. I stood up, my knees trembling slightly, acutely aware that I was an amateur going up against a legal machine. Your Honor, I began, my voice steadier than I felt. I am Ethan Miller, and I am representing myself. I do not dispute that my shed deviates from the current Willow Creek Arc standards. However, my defense is simple. The specific rule I am being sued under is, and has been for nearly 20 years, unenforceable. A ripple of low laughter came from the spectators, a few neighbors who were too afraid to openly support me, and Brenda's silent supporters. Mr. Harrison gave a patronizing smile. Objection. Your Honor, he interjected smoothly. Counsel is arguing conjecture. The rules are recorded and valid. Judge Thompson waved him off. Continue, Mr. Miller. I took a deep breath. This was the moment. I walked to the clerk and presented a single, meticulously preserved copy of the original 1985 Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. Your Honor, I submit this document, the foundational agreement for Willow Creek Estates, recorded October 14, 1985. I directed the judge and Mr. Harrison to Section 9.4, the obscure paragraph I had spent weeks tracing. Section 9.4, Your Honor, is a sunset clause concerning the duration of the Architectural Review Committee's authority. I paused, letting the words hang in the air, then read the critical sentence aloud. The specific architectural control provisions contained in Article 4, including the establishment of the Architectural Review Committee, shall automatically terminate 20 years following the date of this declaration, unless re-ratified by a minimum of 75% of all parcel owners prior to said termination date. The silence that followed was instant and heavy. Mr. Harrison's smug smile evaporated, replaced by a look of bewildered annoyance. He scrambled for his own copy of the CC&Rs, flipping frantically through the pages of the modern, digitized version, which had conveniently omitted or glossed over this historical detail. I continued, pressing my advantage. The 20-year period expired in October 2005. I have thoroughly searched the county recorder's file, and there is no record date, absolutely none of any subsequent re-ratification meeting or filing meeting the 75% threshold required to extend the ARC's enforcement power. Therefore, the Architectural Review Committee has been operating under an expired mandate for 19 years. The rules concerning my shed's color and height, the rules I am being sued over, are not simply debatable. They are legally null and void. Brenda Jenkins' reaction was immediate and visceral. She gasped, a sharp, choked sound, her face turning a sickly shade of crimson and fury. She leaned over and began whispering furiously to Mr. Harrison, who was now sweating visibly, trying to reconcile his expensive knowledge with the brittle paper in the judge's hands. Judge Thompson spent a moment carefully reviewing the clause, her expression shifting from tired skepticism to focused intensity. She looked up, first at Mr. Harrison, then at Brenda, and finally rested her gaze on me. Mr. Harrison, she stated flatly, can you provide documented proof of the 75% majority re-ratification of the ARC's authority in 2005 or any time thereafter? Mr. Harrison stammered, shuffling papers. Your Honor, we operate under the presumption of continuity. This is highly irregular. An outdated technicality, ... double quotes. Judge Thompson cut him off with a sharp glare. Presumption is not law, counsel. If the covenants contain a mandatory self-termination clause that was not properly nullified or extended through the required legal process, the enforcement mechanism is invalid. The original filing supersedes any later, unapproved presumption. She slammed her gavel once, a loud, definitive crack that echoed through the quiet room. Case dismissed. The plaintiff, the Willow Creek Estates HOA, has failed to establish the legal standing of the rules under which they are suing the defendant. Furthermore, the court orders the immediate cessation of all outstanding fines and legal threats against Mr. Miller. It was a total, complete, and stunning victory. I sat down, my adrenaline finally crashing, watching Brenda Jenkins erupt in a silent, furious rage as her lawyer desperately tried to calm her. I had come to court expecting a battle. I left having won a war, and it truly took only 6 minutes from the moment I stood up to the drop of the gavel. The gavel's sharp crack was followed by a moment of absolute, ringing silence. It wasn't the silence of respect, but of utter, stunned disbelief. Brenda Jenkins, still seated at the plaintiff's table, was shaking. Her face was past fury. It was a picture of pure, bewildered defeat, her power crumbling right there on the polished courtroom floor. Her expensive lawyer, Mr. Harrison, leaned in, whispering urgently while flipping hopelessly through the current CC&Rs documents he realized were now little more than expensive toilet paper. I stood there, Ethan Miller, the amateur litigant, absorbing the reality of my victory. The heavy weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying, the fear of financial ruin, the stress of the research, the risk of losing my home, it all lifted in one exhilarating rush. I didn't cheer. I didn't gloat. I simply gathered my one key document, the brittle, victorious 1985 declaration, and walked out. As I exited, I caught the eyes of the few neighbors who had slipped in to watch the spectacle. They quickly averted their gazes, a mixture of fear and thinly veiled admiration on their faces. Later, I would find anonymous notes slipped into my mailbox, simple, unsigned messages saying thank you, Ethan, and it was time. My quiet defiance had resonated, becoming a small spark of rebellion for the entire community. Returning to Willow Creek Estates that afternoon felt surreal. The woodshed, the very thing that started this war, looked exactly as it always had, a practical, forest green structure. But its meaning had changed entirely. It was no longer a violation. It was a monument to victory. The systemic change was immediate and undeniable. Judge Thompson's ruling, once filed, was public record. The moment word spread about the sunset clause that the Architectural Review Committee (ARC) had been enforcing expired rules for 19 years, a palpable shift occurred. Neighbors who had previously filed for TDSARC approval realized they didn't need to. Brenda Jenkins and her board, stripped of their most powerful tool, the ability to levy arbitrary fines based on aesthetics, found their authority instantly neutralized. The HOA itself didn't vanish, but its power to harass, intimidate, and dictate the minor details of people's lives was gone, at least until they could legally manage to hold a valid, costly 75% re-ratification vote, a political feat they lacked the trust and competence to achieve. The lawsuits against other minor violators were quietly dropped. Brenda Jenkins was publicly, absolutely humiliated. She retained her title as HOA President for a few more weeks, but her power was hollow. She was now the woman who brought the association to court and revealed its core mechanism of control was legally defunct. Her aggressive patrolling stopped. Her clipboard stayed firmly in the drawer. Soon after, she sold her house quickly and quietly and left Willow Creek Estates entirely, unable to bear the weight of her defeat and the silent, newfound freedom of her neighbors. My simple refusal to dismantle a woodshed had unexpectedly become a movement that permanently altered the landscape of our community. I never had to touch the shed. I never had to pay a dime of the fines. All it took was the willingness to look deeper, past the immediate threat, and find the forgotten truth buried in the archives. My victory wasn't just personal. It was a win for every homeowner who had ever been bullied by unelected, power-hungry board. My life returned to normal, but better. The neighborhood felt lighter, less suffocated by needless rules. I learned an invaluable lesson that transcended property law. Authority, when based only on presumption and fear, is fragile. All it takes to shatter tyranny is one person willing to challenge the foundation, not just the surface. That is the true power of due diligence. When faced with overwhelming force, you don't need a bigger gun. You need a better map. I found my map in a brittle, old document, and it set me, and my entire community, free. It allowed me to reclaim my solitude and enjoy my quiet, well-deserved American dream, complete with a perfectly functional, forest green woodshed. The story ends here, but the lesson doesn't. My fight against Brenda Jenkins was about a woodshed, but your fight might be about a job, a relationship, or a system. What hidden, outdated sunset clause do you suspect is governing an unfair situation in your own life? And are you willing to do the digging required to expose it and reclaim your power? Let me know in the comments below.